Rod and Nilesh, thank you for the invitation to speak at this seminar today. So I'm going to talk about in silico trials of cardiovascular interventions, and that's really a trial that's performed in a computer. I didn't make it up. It's in Wikipedia, but that's what they're called. So much of this stems from the fact that I've spent 15 years doing trials that have negative outcomes. And I'm trying to look for a mechanism that's going to stop me doing that. It's going to give me confidence that the trial that I'm planning and that I'm undertaking is going to deliver a positive outcome that actually changes practice. On top of that, there's also the needs of patients, increasingly complex patient populations that we're all familiar with. That's, a problem not unique to cardiovascular medicine. We've got new and emerging technology, devices and drugs all the time. And how do we direct the right treatment at the right patient at the right time? We need evidence and we need high-quality trials. But as we know, the trials they take a long time, they're expensive. Very often, as I said, they're negative. And one of the problems we have with them is that very often we design these trials by imputing assumptions that we have derived from data which is not directly relevant to the cohort of patients that we're looking at. And I put a red question mark behind after the last but one sentence in this slide. Observed events often fail to match assumptions. I mean, I would actually say that observed events never match assumptions. Attempts to address the limitations of trial design, whereby you have to assume an awful lot of the facts that are imputed into the trial design. Trying to overcome them by different ways of, powering it to events rather than proportions, timing it to, longer periods of follow-up. All these different ways of mitigating the risks in trial design don't actually overcome many of these problems. This is an example of the kind of imputations and assumptions that you put into a trial. Everything in red there is something that someone has derived, usually from a population that's not directly applicable to your target population. Your event rates, what they're going to be over a long period of follow-up, whether the event rate is linear or non-linear, the total number of patients recruited over any given period of time, the crossover rate, the attrition rate, the patients that die from non-cardiovascular causes. All of these are things that people spend a great deal of time trying to derive very accurate estimates. And why would you do that when you can actually measure it? Because we have it all collected already. And we can use hospital episode statistics to derive all of the information that we want. And we can then conduct virtual trials using that information and design trials that we know will be lean and will test fixed hypotheses that will reduce trial times and allow us to design very efficient randomized trials. The kind of problems that we need to address when we're considering the design of a trial is the scale of the clinical problem. HES data will tell us every patient that we need to identify who may have that condition with any given unit. You can get very granular data about patient recruitment rates. You'll be able to document what the variability in care is. One of the key components of clinical equipoise, the justification for a trial, is that you have variation in care. Variation in care also becomes the control group, the standard care arm of your trial. It gives you event rates that you can design your sample size against. You can measure all of this using hospital episode statistics. You can also use hospital episode statistics to estimate the number of events that are going to happen. You can model the precision by which you can measure those using different combinations of ICD-10 codes. You'll get a very good idea of things like attrition. Unlike almost any feasibility study, you can use ICD-10 codes to model safety. So you can look at non-cardiovascular related diseases, unexpected adverse events that you wouldn't normally be able to model. Your virtual trial will become the data management plan for your eventual trial, should you decide to pursue it. You'll have already defined all your event codes. You'll know how to measure them, and you'll know how to store the data, and so on. And a final thing is that by designing trials in this way, you'll design trials that are acceptable to patients because you'll have a very strong argument of why this trial is important and what the benefits might be. So hospital episode statistics, we know what they are. They have limitations, but those limitations are being steadily overcome. NHS Digital, if you pay them £40,000, will give you all of these different databases in one go for the last 3 years from the NHS. So you can get diagnostic imaging, critical care, all inpatients, all outpatients attendances, all A&E attendances, and that will be linked with ONS data. And you can use the codes from those to calculate what your primary, secondary, and safety outcomes might be. You can also model different kinds of trial design. You can do sensitivity analysis to vary what your inclusion and exclusion criteria might be, to look at how that influences your event rates and your clinical effect estimates. You can also test whether or not the virtual trial you're modeling, what its effect would be if it was applied in the general population. And you can do all of that with modern HDR techniques. So we propose to do this by collaborating with our HDR UK colleagues. And they will be able to model different kinds of trials, different sensitivity analysis, different subgroup analysis, in a way that will identify subgroups that may benefit from trial interventions, but more importantly, those who might not, and those who might therefore be excluded from trials, leading to the greater chance that you're going to detect a significant clinical benefit in any one population. So the aims of our project are to establish methodologies and a systematic framework to carry out in silico trials using HES data, to evaluate the extent to which in silico trials can be conducted, to develop the capacity in processing and analysing real-world data using statistical and machine learning methods. We're using a vanguard where we're going to inform the initial work stream using priorities identified in the Cardiac Surgery James Lind Alliance workshop. And we want to work out how we can deliver a model that can then be applied to other areas of cardiovascular disease, but also other areas of disease, because actually we very often face the same clinical challenges. A key element of this is unwarranted variation. So this is a study that we did with using HES data, where we looked at treatment rates for patients with thoracic aortic disease in the United Kingdom. And we were able to demonstrate that there is significant unwarranted variation in the administration of specific treatments for this disease that cannot be explained by comorbidity, age, demographics, or social deprivation. And actually what there is a random variation in the application of treatments to patients based on the collective wisdom of the clinicians involved in the decision-making. And you can use that randomness to model the random application of interventions in virtual randomized trials. A key element of HES, which overcomes the limitations of, for example, say the NICOR datasets, is HES gives you the information on the people who didn't get the treatment. And that's a key element in whether in how you would model a virtual randomized controlled trial, which you wouldn't be able to do, for example, with NICOR data. So we would use these variations in practice that would allow us to estimate treatment effects. And these would be informed, for example, by Cochrane reviews or other kinds of reviews. And you would use not just artificial intelligence, but also we plan to use instrumental variable analysis. And this capitalizes on the temporal sequence of the information that you receive in HES. You don't get a single data point of a patient's hospitalization episode in HES. You know when their first, their second, their third, their fourth, all their subsequent hospitalizations where that occur. So you can overcome the lead time bias, which is the most common criticism of standard epidemiological analysis. You can also use instrumental variable analysis to overcome the bias by indication, which is the other great limitation of epidemiological analysis. And you can use these to model what the decision-making tree of a clinical trial might be and how it would impact on the outcomes of patients. A final consideration is that the NIHR and other funding bodies are very, very keen to look at very new and innovative trial designs. And one of the things that you can do is you can test those innovative trial designs. And for example, the dexamethasone for cardiac surgery study uses what's called a modified Zealand design, which is really efficient. So they're able to do a trial of 2,000 patients that's going to cost £250,000. So we'll have a range of techniques. I don't want to go into them here. They'll be led by our HDR UK collaborators in Leicester. We're collaborating as well with other clinical trials units across the country. Bristol Surgical Trial Centre and the Surgical Intervention Trials Unit in Oxford, and it'll be supported in part by the Leicester BHF Accelerator. We've decided to use the Cardiac Surgery Priority Setting Partnership as the vanguard project to develop the methods that may then be widened and applied to others. The Cardiac Surgery Vanguard project followed on from a workshop in February 2017, where it was agreed that a prioritization exercise that could identify the top 10 research priorities in cardiac surgery could be used to leverage research funding that would justify 10 key trials in cardiac surgery over the next 10 years. This led to the James Lind Alliance priority setting partnership that was funded by Heart Research UK, and this was a great example of a collaboration between Heart Research UK funding a British Heart Foundation group to undertake a priority setting partnership in the national interest. It was a great example of collaboration, and we were lucky to be well funded, and that's been key to the success of the proposal. Another impetus for us was the Cardiothoracic Surgical Trials Network in the States, where a group of 20 or so units in the United States got together. They identified a series of research priorities, and they went to the National Heart and Lung and Blood Institute, as well as Health Canada, and requested $50 million for research funding. And that may seem like a lot of money, but in America that's what it costs. But they had multiple high-quality, high-impact outputs from that. And these trials, although they were relatively small, have shaped practice. And this is an important model for us to show that if we work together, that we can deliver research that changes things. The UK has significant research capacity. This is an old slide, but this showed the number of patients recruited to multi-centre surgical trials, not trials of stents versus surgery or TAVI versus surgery, but surgical trials and surgical patients over a 9-year period or an 8-year period. And basically it showed that we recruited about 6,000 patients to NIHR multi-centre trials in that time, despite having next to no infrastructure. So it shows that even with poor infrastructure, the UK has this enormous research capacity, which we can tap into to deliver transformative research. If you're not familiar with the James Lind Alliance, you do an initial stakeholder survey where you ask people to name 2 research priorities. We targeted 1,000 research questions. We recruited from over 700 patients in the end. It took us about a year. We reached out to over 200 patient groups. And one of the key elements of the James Lind Alliance is that it involves patient and public participation from the outset. It has an independent chair who's appointed by the James Lind Alliance. A significant proportion of the steering committee have to be patients or carers. And it's a very, as I'll show you in just a second, it's quite an interesting procedure to do. So after we got the first 1,000 questions, we close the initial survey. Then we employ some data scientists to compare those research priorities against the existing Cochrane systematic reviews, as well as American Heart Association, European Society for Cardiology guidelines, and so on. And what you do is you extract the ones where the questions have been answered or whether or not there's little justification for a trial. You rationalize that to, say, 50 questions, and then you submit a second survey. And you ask people to prioritize those the top 10 priorities that they consider from those 43. And these are the results of our second survey as of the 10th of May. And the interesting thing of this is that sometimes patients, carers, and healthcare professionals have completely different ideas of what research priorities are. So, for example, does prehabilitation benefit heart surgery patients? Well, patients and carers seem to think so, but healthcare professionals, not so much. Again, the other thing to point out here is that chronic conditions features very highly in almost all of the questions. All of the questions more or less dealt with some aspect of frailty. And the interesting thing there is that's not just a problem for cardiac surgeons, that's a problem for everybody, and is going to be increasing a problem as time goes on. So it tells us that that maybe we don't want to do research of stitching it with your right hand versus stitching it with your left hand, but slightly more thoughtful questions about how we can optimize frail patients for surgery or whether we should be operating on them at all. So then the outputs that we expect from our preliminary project are a granular assessment of the availability of the target patient cohorts by centre and over time that we could provide to a potential funder. Defining the characteristics of target populations and their heterogeneity, and this is key because it's likely that what works in diabetics with chronic kidney disease doesn't work in patients who are young. And what we want to do is we want to identify different patient cohorts where we believe that interventions would be more likely to be effective. We'll be able to model different trial designs. We'll be able to optimize trial design through sensitivity analysis, where you adjust the number of ICD-10 codes that you use by including or leaving some out. And what we will then have is a data management plan where we can actually use that data, those codes and that data management plan and the algorithms we've used to measure those as our data management plan for our ultimate trial, which is really important when you're thinking of using routinely collected data for randomized trials, as is exemplified in the recent modification or the forthcoming modification to the consort statement in relation to using routinely collected data in randomized trials. So we expect to have our first output within 12 months from January 2020. We want to make this as a resource that's available to every trial that comes through the British Heart Foundation Clinical Research Collaborative. As I said, our Vanguard project will be in cardiac surgery, but this will be a resource for everyone who wants to do trials in cardiovascular medicine. And we have to limit to cardiovascular medicine because of the restrictions that NHS data place on you. You can't just ask for the entire NHS digital data set. But we've asked for the entire everyone with a cardiovascular disease code in the HES data set. And we should be able to roll it out for other specialties. It would want to be a collaborative venture. It takes about 6 months. These analyses are not straightforward. So if you want to come to us and ask us for help with the design of trials, we need to have quite a bit of a run-in. We might generate revenue by sharing this data with industry. And we ultimately will provide a template for other researchers because we're not the only people who have to deal with frail patients. Everyone has to deal with frail patients. And we'll set up a dissemination plan with workshops. We're also trying to disseminate this through the UK CRC Clinical Trials Unit network at the minute. Everybody benefits. It's a circular win-win. We can design trials that we think are going to work. We're not going to spend 10 years doing, you don't want to do a big trial. It takes you 10 years. It's a negative result. You're not going to have time to do many of them. The funders will be happier. They're less likely to do trials that are going to be negative. They're more likely to have trials that progress. Patients will be better. The NHS will be better. Our life sciences sector deal envisages a 50% increase in the number of trials undertaken in the UK in the next 5 years. By being able to design lean trials that use routinely collected data and that has priority questions, we can only feed into that. So thank you for your time, and I can take some questions.
It strikes me, Gavin, that this type of work would be easily extended to the assessment of the outcomes of the clinical trial you eventually did choose to run, in that you would parallel the modelling as a means of providing effective outcome data with minimal resource. Would that be fair?
Yes, so your virtual trial will become the data management plan of your ultimate trial.
Hi, I'm Tuti Boeser from the British Association of Nursing and Cardiovascular Care. I've got two questions, actually. So I guess one is, what are the provisions for complex interventions, like psychoeducational interventions and nursing interventions that we'd like to put through a clinical trial? And the second is, our society did scope PSP, priority setting partnership for cardiovascular care, especially because of the reasons of those questions that you were getting, a lot about, quality of care, outcomes that are really, really important to patients that actually we felt as nurses we could intervene. So we are waiting for your publications, but also the one that's ongoing for the advanced heart failure PSP. And so and we were advised by James Lynn to wait to then see what comes out of that. So actually we could either do a hybrid for the nursing sort of nursing care PSP, or we need a new one. I guess maybe in terms of the BHF CRC, how does this fit in making sure that there's not a lot of duplication and just all working together?
Yeah, so clearly we want to develop a resource for anyone who wants to run a trial through the BHF CRC. I think that would be our key mission. We think it has wider value to other groups who can either work with us collaboratively or commission work with us. We hopefully will have a sustainable program whereby we'll have funding for up to 3 years and we'll be able to run this. The complex interventions is really interesting. So, of course, the NIHR now is almost, exclusively interested in evaluating complex interventions. And there are lots of different questions in that pathway. And you won't be able to model all of them with virtual data, but you'll be able to model some of them. You also would need to accompany any virtual trial with a Cochrane-style review. And what you can take is you can take the population that have been used to derive the Cochrane systematic review, and you can apply that to your population with the same average age demographics, ranges, and so on. And you can see whether or not the trial that you're proposing would have the same effect as your Cochrane review. So this doesn't give you your minimal clinically important difference. It also won't be able to measure the effects of those complex interventions because by and large, they're not delivered in secondary care. They're very often delivered in primary care. So you've identified a key limitation, but we think that there's still value in terms of cohorts, measuring outcomes, measuring safety in the target population that you're seeking, that when combined with the Cochrane-style review, will be able to guide you towards a better trial design. And in respect to your other question, the reason that we've got so many of these issues is that that's what's key to patients. And we have very strong representation from nurses and allied health professionals on the James Lind Alliance, led by Julie Sanders from Barts. But actually, a lot of innovation is actually in healthcare delivered by nurses and allied health professionals. They do most of the research as well.
Well, I think it's about leading their own research and, kind of establishing their own sort of them as PIs and CIs, I think is something that...
But the BHF have just launched a fellowship scheme for NAHPs, which is, I think, supposed to directly address that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
So, John, quick question and quick answer, please.
Okay, just to remind you, north of the border, it's not HES, but we have linked data records where you can get all the prescriptions, all the lab tests, all the imaging tests, all the ECGs. You can get the real-time ECG. So think of north of the border as well as south. We recently had a grant knocked back by the BHF based on the fact that we were going to use linked data for the outcomes. And it was pointed out quite correctly to us that, of course, if you're willing to wait for 6 to 12 months after your study is complete, you might get the data. But that doesn't help the DSMB and it doesn't help you at the end of the trial. So I think the linked data is going to be very useful for longer-term registries. It's going to be useful for backup data, but it's not really useful for our primary endpoints yet until we can get much faster reporting. And I just don't envisage that happening anytime soon.
So, great question. So the challenges are, what's the key role of the trial? The great example is the oxygen trial in myocardial infarction by the Swiss Heart Group. Yeah, Swedish Heart Group. So basically, the outcome was you lived or you died, and the intervention was they either gave you oxygen or they didn't. And the only outcome that they reported at the ASC was whether you lived or you died. They used their ICD-10 codes or equivalent to record safety. In a sense, that's all the trial, that's the only thing that's of any value in the trial anyway. You know, it's whether or not the trial is designed to mitigate the bias that surrounds the measurement of your primary outcome and the delivery of your intervention.
Well, maybe Sweden's much better than we are, but it's 6 months before you can reliably get the linked mortality data.
And that's true. So the limitation is in reporting of safety. So that's the limitation you have. There are...
And also when you come to the end of your trial, you've got to wait 6 months for the data to come in.
I mean, maybe Martin will handle this in his presentation shortly. It's about data. Very last.
Yeah. Just a quick question. A lot of data isn't published, which is negative. How do you use that information to guide you not to go down the wrong road?
Well,
can you get it? You know,
for the last 5 to 8 years, all trials have been registered. So, you know, searches of trial databases will tell you if there are trials out there that haven't reported. And that's a historical problem, which is less of a problem now, given that journals won't accept any trial if it hasn't been registered prospectively.
Okay, great, Gavin, thank you. We'd better move on. Okay, thank you. And the